Hello and good evening. My name is Helen Sprott. I'm Executive Director here at NMC Recordings, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this edition of the Listening Club with composer Param Vir and writer Stephen Newbould. And Param and Stephen are here to talk about Param's album, Wheeling Past the Stars, which has just been released on NMC. Param Vir is an outstanding figure in British music. Born in Delhi, his background is rich in both arts and sciences. His mother was a distinguished musician and poet. His father was a mathematician and electronics engineer. Param Vir studied piano and composition at school and quickly decided that his destiny was to be a composer in the Western contemporary style. He first came to the UK at the invitation of Sir Peter Maxwell Davies to Dartington International Summer School, and he moved permanently to London the following year to study with Oliver Knussen. Param Vir has received multiple prizes for his composition. He's been commissioned by leading impresarios, opera companies and festivals all over the world, and his music is championed and performed by leading new music ensembles. So in a moment, we're going to join Param Vir and Stephen Newbould as they talk about Wheeling Past the Stars, and you will have the opportunity to join in by typing questions and comments in the chat box. But first, some music. Here is an excerpt from Param Vir's Raga Fields.
Well, hello everyone, I'm Stephen Newbould, and it's wonderful to hear that piece Raga Fields, which I'm delighted to have played a very small part in helping Param Vir, PV, as everyone who knows him calls him, to bring into the world. And also indeed in my former role as Artistic Director of Birmingham Contemporary Music Group, to have also played a part in another couple of commissions, Theatre of Magical Beings and Constellations, both of which will have to wait for the next NMC CD. It's wonderful to have this disc out on NMC, Wheeling Past the Stars, PV's first major recorded survey, and it's long overdue. This survey stretches back. The earliest piece on here, Before Krishna, which we'll talk about in a minute. Indeed, we'll talk about Raga Fields as it's the most recent piece towards the end of our listening club discussion. But Before Krishna goes back almost 35 years. And actually, there could be any number of surveys of PV's work from the 50 or so pieces in the catalogue. So it's great that this disc is out. In thinking back to those pieces, PV, that we worked on together. Well, you worked on them. I just simply opened a door and there was the stage, but you of course wrote them. And I was thinking, what, as artistic director of an ensemble like BCMG, what was it that I would look for in music to program or in a particular composer? And I realized that it's rather like the kind of thing one looks for or finds in a new friend. And that is, it's something which you've not had before. You can't say what it's going to be until you get it. And that's, in the case of your music, and I've said this to you before, it has a sheer presence and a vitality, I find. A living entity there on the stage in front of me. And indeed, the stage, in the more formal use of that word, is quite important to you, because every decade or so in your compositional output, there's a major operatic statement. And I know we'll touch on this at the end, because that's what one of those is what you're working on at the moment. But given what I say about my own impression of your music's vitality and life, and indeed what I feel to be the kind of drama of your pieces, all of them really, I wonder if for you, your music is inherently also a kind of theatre.
That's a tough question. I do think very theatrically, but I think it's perhaps the reason why you feel as theatrical is because I designed the music almost like pieces of oral sculpture. And I also want to know what the piece is about before I can write it. Even if it's just a purely instrumental piece, there has to be something that energizes that. And that energizing, for me, is always some sort of dramatic process. And the creation of the...
that makes...
Go ahead.
Sorry, I know that we've got the Zoom thing, but yes, that makes perfect sense to me. The one other question that I wanted to ask you, just a very general kind of question before we plunge into this disc, is an easy question to ask, but a much harder one to answer. Do you know why you compose?
I'll tell you why I don't compose, because that's very fashionable for people to say that a composer is expressing himself. I have absolutely no interest in expressing myself. I'm not trying to write about myself, and I'm not trying to make people interested in me and in my ideas. Of course, I have ideas, but they're about wonderful things that I see in the world, wonderful people that I have met, or people that are historical, extraordinary ideas that people have brought into the world. And these are the things that I'm trying to reach to through the music. Ultimately, it is a form of expression, but I like to think of a very interesting comment that Anish Kapoor made. And he said, my psychobiology goes through my pieces, but my works are not about that. I would say the same.
Yes.
So if you look at the array of titles of my pieces and the sources of inspiration, they are not all Indian mythology. They are scattered all over the world. Right now, I'm deeply involved with the Syrian issues and what's happening in the Middle East. So it's the world. The world is a theater. I mean, and there's extraordinary theatrical things, I mean, going on in the world. Theater reflects the world, and the world is, you know, a gigantic theater. So of course, it's being drawn into the music as I engage with the world.
Yes, thank you. Let's go right back to the beginning, because it's very interesting. And Helen, in her introduction, talked about your parents, and you were surrounded by Indian classical music as a youngster, and you could have chosen to follow that course yourself. You did indeed study tabla for a while. What was it that decided you on essentially a European journey as a composer in music rather than an Indian classical one?
I actually don't know. It's almost it seems almost inconsequential, the way in which the decision was made. It wasn't any kind of big decision that I'm going to now learn Western music. I did start to learn some Indian classical singing from my mother, or from my mother's teacher. And I also did a little bit of tabla at that time when I was about 8 or 9, but it didn't really take off. And then we were walking outside my school, and my mother said to me, when I was 9, would you like to learn the piano? And I just said yes. It wasn't like a cosmic decision, though I suppose it had big, implications later on. It's something that very few people did. In fact, I think I was probably one of only 2 or 3 children in my school when I was growing up that was doing Western classical music. And in fact, I was very well known in the school for being a Western musician, being a pianist, and so on.
And I think indeed you were accompanying school chapel plain-song on harmonium, I gather, during the school days.
Yes. I got drafted into the school chapel very quickly because I could read music, and I could also notate. They would give me songs that they didn't have scores for, and I would just hear them, and I would put them into notation. And then I wrote up all the carols, the 4-part carols. So I wrote up 4 parts for the choir at Christmas time, and produced, sheets of music for, for all the singers. So I was accompanying plain chant on a pedal harmonium with my feet providing the in the air in the bellows. So it's not how plain song is supposed to be done, but I think it's quite unusual that I, as an Indian, and I wasn't a Roman Catholic, I had plain song as a very early experience,
Yeah, which is a wonderful thing to have.
Oh, yes.
And around that time, I think when you were 13, you read a pivotal article. I think it's British High Commission or a newsletter. You read an article which really had a very strong impression on you and was kind of life-changing, didn't you? About Oliver Knussen. Would you talk about that?
Yes, that was right. I saw an article. There was an international cooperation club in the school, and I was the president of that at the ripe age of 13 or something. And I used to write off to the British Council and ask for information about British composers. And I have photographs of Benjamin Britten and many others, Elgar and so on. And in one of their magazines, there was a little article just about that big with a photograph of Oliver Knussen composing at the piano. He was 13 years old and he was the same age as me. And I saw that and I said, I can do that also. I can do that. So I wrote to them, I wrote to the British Council and said, can I write to him? Can you give me his address? And they wrote back. I still have the letter from the British High Commission saying you can write to him, his father, Stuart Knussen, at the London Symphony Orchestra. But I didn't have the courage to write to him, so I didn't.
Well, we'll pick up that story in a little while. In the meantime, you did find a teacher in Delhi, Hans-Joachim Kohlreuter, for a couple of years. I mean, really a key time for you, 14 to 16. Yeah. 2 brief years, and he was an emigre from Germany who'd moved to Brazil, but he was in Delhi. Tell us about that experience and what and how important that was for you.
Well, it was absolutely fundamentally crucial because between that time and the time that I came to England, I never had any formal training in composition. And by that time, I was 14, it had become clear to me that I wanted to be a composer. And so he happened to be in Delhi, at the head of the Goethe Institute in Delhi. And he was, very well-known composer in Brazil and Germany. So he taught me 16th century counterpoint, starting off with writing a cantus firmus and species counterpoint, and then free counterpoint. And then I also did the Hindemith book on harmony with him. And I also got a lesson
he studied under Hindemith, I think.
Sorry?
He studied with Hindemith, I believe.
I don't know that. Maybe, perhaps. He used to play he was a flautist. He used to play the flute sonata, Hindemith flute sonata. So I did, and this was very important. And I used to just wait for this once a week lesson, 1 hour, because he would ask me to write counterpoints, and I would write 50, and he would just correct the last 10, So it was the only formal training I had. And regarding 12 tone, he just drew out a 12-note row and said, this is the row, and this is the inversion of that, and this is the backwards form, and this is the inversion of the backwards form. And now you have to write a piece. And I wrote a few small pieces at that point, but I didn't know how to develop them.
It's interesting because, of course, 12-10 technique, which he'd taken from Germany to Brazil, and where his friends were, amongst others, were Villa-Lobos, and he sort of introduced that technique to Brazil. I wonder whether, I mean, we'll come on to Before Krishna, the first piece on this disc in a moment, but I wondered first whether at that age, 14, 15, 16, already you realize the sort of logic of your situation would lead you to a life outside India, perhaps in Europe, whether Hans-Joachim Kohlreuter, as an emigre himself, moving continents, was a good example for you, or did he give you any specific advice that helped your future career as a composer? Is that something you talked about?
Well, he did say that I should go and study, and in fact, he thought that I should go and study at the Musikhochschule in Freiburg, where there was an interesting teacher. But I couldn't get scholarship. In those days, there were no scholarships. My family was quite poor, and my mother, usually was able to just pay my music lessons. So I didn't have any way to come to Europe or to America at that point. So I would say I languished.
Yeah. And then, yeah. Well, and he left when you were 16. And as you've said, there was this then long period of self-led study before you came to the UK to study in 1984. And actually, that it is quite extraordinary. And it suggests to me an immense amount of self-discipline and self-belief to keep going for what was over a decade. You've mentioned there were one or two other young composers around studying Western music. It was before the time of the internet, of course. I mean, did you have any contact with people to encourage you, or was it really just all down to you?
Almost nothing. It was almost nothing. And I was on a track just by myself, and it wasn't really understood. And a lot of people, in fact, told me to give it up, because there was no way to go forward. And to some extent, I had thought about not doing it anymore because there was no way to study it. I wanted to get high quality study. It's only, and that happened, as you know, when I met Peter Maxwell Davies. So they were very difficult years. But right after he left, I was quite devastated because I no longer had any teacher to teach me. So I got hold of a book on counterpoint, and I taught myself to write more counterpoint based on 16th century styles from that book, and correcting it myself, since there was nobody to correct it.
And you were also becoming politically aware at this age, around the time that Hans-Joachim Kullrocker left 16. You discovered Beethoven, you discovered what was going on in the world, and those two things were connected in a way, I think, their significance.
Yes. In 68, of course, you had the Czechoslovak Revolution, and this had a huge impact upon me. And I made a statement in the newspaper about that. It was published. I got a letter back from the Czechoslovak embassy saying, thank you for your support for our freedom struggle. And I was very interested in freedom struggles. And of course, that was connected to Beethoven as well. But Beethoven came through a completely different route, because it's the first time when I listened to his symphonies from the age of 16. In fact, listening to this amazing Herbert von Karajan recordings of the Beethoven symphonies, which came out in the late 60s. I was listening to those and I was mesmerized. And it's the first time I would say that music really went deep inside. And I knew that this is what music is about. This extraordinary, radiant experience that you seem to experience when you listen to Beethoven's music. Something that lies far beyond the normal world. It feels as if he has an access to some extraordinary dimension from where this music comes. And there is no way to learn to write like that. You either have it or you don't. He obviously had it in a very high degree.
Well, let's jump now to you coming to the UK in 1984, where suddenly you find yourself studying with Oliver Knussen. I mean, we'll talk about Peter Maxwell Davies and the centrality of that relationship a little later. But in 1984, you're studying with Oliver Knussen. Actually, in a couple of years, you go to Tanglewood, and one of your pieces is done there under Ollie's tutelage. And then we come to Before Krishna, the first piece on this disc. That piece comes along. Tell us how that came about and what you took from your conversations with Ollie to help you write that piece.
Well, this piece, I think this string orchestral format was because it was put out that was the format that required to write a piece for the Benjamin Britten Composition Prize in '87. and it had to be a string orchestral piece. So I didn't have a good feeling for strings. In fact, Ollie and I discussed that, and we both thought at a certain point that they were just note-producing machines. You know, if you don't play the string instrument, you don't really know how it works. And I didn't have a natural sense for that. Obviously, I had learned the piano. So he made me 2 cassette tapes, which we called string orgy tapes #1 and string orgy tape #2. And on these, he put very important pieces of string music, you know, from Ludoslavsky and Ligeti and William Bolton and many other composers. I studied these tapes. I studied this music. I borrowed some of the recording, the Alban Berg lyric suite, for instance. I really listened to that for many days. And then very quickly, I generated a 12-tone row, which you can show. And that row allowed me to create...
Let's put that up on the screen.
That row allowed me to create...
Sorry to interrupt you, people.
Sorry.
Sorry, I think we can... Maybe you're seeing that now, the 12-note row that you use. Would you just say something about that PV, what that means and how you used it?
Well, it's got the prime version on the top, the 12 notes, and then the inversion below. And I decided to start with the inversion because the prime version represented the spirit of the Redeemer, Krishna as Redeemer. And the inversion was the inverted state of life in Mathura, where a tyrant ruled and terrible things were going on. So the inversion is what starts the piece with that very angular glissando-inflected melody. And then it's at the point of Krishna's birth, the other row is born. The prime version comes into play, and it then ricochets across the orchestra in a very precise isorhythm.
Let's hear a bit of Before Krishna. We'll talk about it after that, but let's hear our next audio clip, which is from, what are we going to hear, PV? The beginning, I think, of Before Krishna?
Yes, it's the beginning, yes.
Yeah. So that was Odeline de la Martinez conducting the London Chamber Orchestra in that stunningly vivid performance of Before Krishna. PV, it seems to me this music has immense energy and propulsion. It's got great momentum. There's big angular intervals you mentioned. I mean, it was written very fast, I believe, in a matter of, what, a couple of weeks?
I wrote it, I think, I started it on the 18th of December, and I finished it just before New Year. I think 11 days. And then that was a rough draft, all the notes were there. And I then wanted to copy it super neatly, because we didn't have any notation programs then. So I copied it with, ruling every line, every stem and so on. And I stayed up for 5 nights with very little sleep, 2 or 3 hours of sleep and black coffee to get the job done in 5 days.
You alluded to the title and what really isn't a program as such, because your pieces don't tend to have programs, but they do often have these vivid titles. Actually, I'm quite interested because Before Krishna was the first piece that has that kind of vivid, allusive title drawn from perhaps many kinds of world literature, mythology that as your pieces do. Up until then, those early pieces you wrote, Contrapulse, Concertante, Antiphons and Elegies, those titles could have belonged to any number of pieces by other British composers, but now you're not afraid to show that sort of plural cultural heritage in the way you title your pieces and give them these strong, descriptive, allusive titles.
Right. Also, it was something that I thought about for some time, and this was sort of an imaginary opera in my head, and I thought this would be the overture to that. So it coalesced many ideas about an archetypical being like Krishna. It's just an archetype.
Yes. And this was your only 12-tone piece, I believe.
Apart from the sketches I wrote as a young boy, this was the only 12-tone piece, but I actually used the 12-tone piece, 12-tone row and technique as a quick motivic generator, because I needed to find the notes. And also I always wanted to discover new ways of creating pitch material and pitch worlds, not just writing simple diatonic music, which I grew up with. So I tried different techniques in each of these early pieces. In fact, I used to ask Oli for a mantra for each piece,
Yes, that's interesting. And we're now going to jump actually a couple of decades almost to the next piece, Hayagriva, on the disc. I want to say that, obviously using 12-tone technique is to a certain extent a way of organizing structure, organizing relation between form and content. You were soon to discover a new way of doing that, which has been really uniquely your own, a new way of mapping out structure or relating form and content. And it's a kind of compositional method you use and still use to this day. I wonder if you'd say something about what that is and what it gives you, because it's fascinating.
Well, it's basically the technique of writing templates. So especially if you're writing large ensemble pieces, I always felt that what you experience as a listener when you listen to an orchestral work is the flow of energy and the flow of orchestration. Now, you can't just write one bar and then add another bar, then add another bar. You have to have a blueprint for the whole thing. You have to see how the whole piece stands together. How do you compartmentalize time? Do you divide the 9 minutes of a particular movement into 9 equal segments? So I wanted a technique to do that, but also I wanted to create a new gestural rhythmic language. And I'd always did these templates away from the piano. I didn't want to compose at the piano. I composed them on the table.
And I think we can see one of these templates, PV. I think we can see one of these now on our next slide, which I believe is a template that we'll be looking at for one of your big orchestral piece for the proms, Cave of Luminous Mind.
Right.
Tell us what we're looking at there.
Well, you can see, I don't know how clear it is to see, but there are 9 segments of the music, 9 minutes basically, 9 equal minutes in one segment. They are not structural, the segments are not structural. The structures are completely different. So you will see some lines vertically that say W1, W2, W3. These were wave-like formations of glissandi that move slowly upwards. And these glissandi are in the strings, and they are emblematic of the meditational type of process. So they come quite regularly. So these glissandi are almost like pointing out the structural divisions of the piece. And you also see, since I'm looking at time as a block that I'm articulating and sculpting inside, there's also a green line about 2/3 of the way down, which says golden mean. I don't know if it's visible, but I knew exactly where the golden section was. And there's something that happens there on that to articulate the golden section. So this enables me to get not only a sense of form, but also a sense of what kind of energy is manifesting in sound. And then one can write that. Otherwise, if you improvise, then you're simply putting your improvisations into notation, and that's not interesting for me anyway.
One thing that strikes me, PV, looking at these templates, which I know the initial templates you refer to as energy templates, is the color. I mean, they're highly colored, and that's, it appears to me that you see music in colors. I mean, Messiaen is a favorite composer I know, and that you share that with him. And actually, when we come to listen in a moment to Hayagriva, there's a strong importance of areas of color for you in that piece. Is that the piece? I mean, is that true that individual lines and notes and harmonic areas are color to you? I mean, do you see your music in that way?
I don't see it in that way. It's not as if I've got certain key structures or certain things that denote. It's actually the energy of the music. For instance, the first part of Hayagriva is about the horse, and it's a war horse, and it's an extraordinarily physical sound, which is then associated with the color red, because red is a very earth color. So in fact, my color thinking comes down very much to the colors of the rainbow spectrum, which exist on the human body as well. And you can see it when you flash your NMC CD, you'll see the rainbow colors on that. But the red, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet are the colors that actually sit on the human spine as well and suck in energy. So the red color is a very physical color. It's a very earthy color. So when I'm writing pieces of that nature, for instance, for the horse, then it is very earthy. Blue is a much more transcendental color, so that came out in the second part of the piece, the third part of the piece, I mean.
So in moving on to Hayagriva, we also need to talk about this really important relationship with Peter Maxwell Davies. Just say something about that and the impact that had on this piece, which, as you say, was also inspired by, well, there are various things, aren't there? There's this sculpture, which I think we'll see an image of as well. Could you just say something about those, the sculpture, and also about Max?
Well, Max met me at Dartington, and he, when I first went to Dartington in 1983, and he was incredibly generous and kind, and he gave me a scholarship for the whole month, so I didn't have to pay anything at all. And I attended his composition course, and then a second composition course in the second 2 weeks of the. And I wrote there a piece for a 10 strong ensemble conducted by David Robertson, who was on the conducting course at that time. And after that piece was performed, and that was the first time I suddenly, in a course of 2 weeks, wrote a 2-movement piece, which surprised me more than anybody else. Max then said, come and see me in London and don't disappear into India. You have to come back and study, and I will help you to come back to study. And then he wrote wonderful recommendation letters, which enabled me to get scholarships and support and so on. So that was his role, and he was always there as a friend. So he invited me to come for a few days to Sanday in Orkney and stay in his composition studio, because he didn't have a guest room, so I stayed in the studio with the piano. And I started this piece there.
And there was this poster and sculpture that kind of coincided and gave the piece its title.
Yeah, that was I was in the London Underground, and I was passing by, exiting somewhere, and I suddenly saw this gigantic poster of the art fair in London, and it was a picture of a man with a horse's head. And I was struck by that and started to stare at that, and suddenly the whole group of people were surrounding me and watching this poster, wondering why I find it so interesting. Well, I had recognized that as an Indian archetype, Hayagriva, which is a man with it's a god with a horse's, a man with a horse's head. And there's a whole narrative around that. So the sculpture is by Beth Carter, and she didn't call it Hayagriva, she called it Standing Horse, I think. So I located her and I found this sculpture and I bought it with half of my commission money. It's a bronze and it sits on my composition desk and protects renewal and knowledge, I like to think.
And I think we're going to see an image of that and also some of images of you in Max's studio while we listen to this clip of Hayagriva. Just tell us what we're going to listen to here. I think it's the piece is sort of in 3 panels. I think we're going to listen to something from the last panel, PV.
Yes, we're going to listen to the last panel, which I identified as the blue panel. Actually, I called it Sapphire in my score. And it features a cor anglais solo. And the cor anglais, in fact, is a very emblematic instrument in my pieces. It has come many times, and it always comes with a song of compassion and generosity and healing. And it first appeared as a song accompanying the peacock in my second opera, Broken Strings. So the cor anglais solo was very prominent there. So it comes in very special moments.
Well, let's hear it. So this is from Hayagriva. So that was Mika Hummel conducting the Schoenberg Ensemble, Hayagriva. Just before we leave that piece, PV, there was a direct influence from Max that went into that piece. A little.
Yes, I told Max that there are 3 colors that I'm focusing on in the 3 different movements, and he said, and they were red, green, and blue. And he said he wrote a piece with those 3 colors. And it was when he was a teenage composer, and he showed me the score. It was actually fully bound, but it was in pencil manuscript or ink manuscript, I don't remember. And it was called Parade, and it had these 3 colors, and it had an idiosyncratic 12-note melody. It wasn't a 12-tone melody, but a 12-note melody. And I asked him if I could quote that, which I did, and he said, of course. And then I quoted that at the end of my piece, just as a mark of respect, because the piece started its journey in his studio.
Yeah, that's lovely. We're going to move on a couple of years now to 2007 and Wheeling Past the Stars, this song cycle for soprano and cello. So smaller forces. The cellist Johan de Saram had asked you for a cello piece, and this enabled you to return to another really important collaborator for you. Can you just talk about that, that collaboration and the circumstances of this piece and your choice of text?
Yes, well, Rohan de Saram very definitely wanted me to write some sort of work drawing some Indian context, and he was very, very fond of Tagore. And of course, Tagore was an enormous influence in my life from my teenage years. Again, in 1968, it was a very important element in my thinking. And so I chose 4 poems. And of course, if you're going to write Tagore poems and you said them in English, then the only translations I could possibly use are the ones by William Radice, which are brilliant, incredible, the best translations I've ever seen. And in fact, William had written the libretto for my first opera, Snatched by the Gods, which is also a Tagore poem, which we drew out a narrative from that. So it was a natural choice to take 4 different poems from William's translation. There were 4 contrasting poems which sort of give a portrait of Tagore, in my view, different facets of Tagore.
And I disappeared then a little bit with my Zoom connection, but I'm imagining that you spoke a little bit about William Radice and the translations. Of course, he was a key figure for you. If so, we're going to hear a clip, in fact, of the last song, New Birth. Would you just say something about that text and your approach to setting it?
Well, it's quite a wonderful poem, because I would say it's like a job description for any prime minister or any president anywhere in the world. And I don't know how many of them would ever come up to the standards of this poem. I mean, it has a line, a key line, which is not in this sung fragment. Will you perhaps, where a tide of blood besmirches your path, where there is malice and discord, construct a dam of peace, a place of meeting and pilgrimage. And I think it's a very important key to Tagore's thinking about the world and about the humanity that we need to bring into the world and support and fight inhumanity. There is so much violence in the world today, and Tagore was very conscious of that, and he was constantly engaging with the world. So this was a very key poem, and it ends the cycle.
Yeah, so let's hear that now. This is from New Birth, from Wheeling Past the Stars. So that was Patricia Ochterlony and Ulrich Heinen with Wheeling Past the Stars. And a quick plug for my former my friends at BCMG, who on Sunday the 20th of June in Birmingham Town Hall will be re-emerging live from pandemic lockdowns, etc., with a 5 p.m. concert, Birmingham Town Hall, with excerpts from Wheeling Past the Stars, and also the full ensemble for a performance of Hayagriva, which you've heard, conducted by Geoffrey Patterson. So you can go to BCMG's website or Town Hall Symphony Hall website. PV will be there, I will be there. Do go along to that. Let's now turn, PV, to the most recent piece on this disc from 2014, Raga Fields, which we heard a little clip of right at the beginning. This piece really had its genesis stretching right back to a rather interesting, in a way, to an article you were commissioned for by the Times of India. This is to do with Mozart and Tansen. Could you explain about this, please?
Well, I was in Bombay at that time, in fact, studying tabla with a tabla maestro. And somehow or the other, this meeting happened between me and a senior editor, Darrell De Monte, a wonderful editor at the Times of India. And he was doing an initial dialogue. So he asked me to write something. And I said what I would do is write an imaginary dialogue between Mozart and Tansen, who was the court musician of Akbar, the Mughal emperor. And my explicit agenda was to talk about pastiche-ridden East-West synthesis music, which was beginning to show itself, on the world stage. And I was very consciously annoyed about this form of pastiche and simple diatonic harmonies accompanying orchestration reminiscent of Indian film music. And what annoyed me also was how the Western ensemble was always completely shortchanged and reduced to providing a backing band for the Indian soloist. And I thought this is not right. The two musics are very powerful and they should be able to come together in some other way. I couldn't work that out, so I stayed away from it. But this dialogue was excoriating about this problem. And I did offer a solution. In fact, I quoted about a piece by my former teacher, Hans-Joachim Kohlreuter, who had written a piece in which he took 6 notes of the rag. I think it was a rag called Rohini or Sohini, I don't remember. And then he had the other 6 notes on the orchestra. So it would obviously be all 12 notes. So that's a very daring thing to do. And that sort of planted a seed at that time. I've never heard that piece because I was in the middle of my board exams from Cambridge, so I didn't listen to it. But that was extraordinary. So that's how the piece, and that's how that dialogue came about.
That dialogue came about, and you may even see a slide. I think we've got up of a cartoon that Mario Miranda made for that
yes,
article, which is absolutely wonderful.
I liken this melange to East-West synthesis to the Witch's Cauldron from Macbeth. And in fact, my dialogue between Mozart and Tansen starts with Tansen saying, double, double toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble. And they have all these, and I asked Mario to draw this cauldron with all these instruments from West and East being thrown inside willy-nilly to make up a kind of a potpourri.
Well, let's move forward now, and you're writing Raga Fields, which I should say that on the early reviews of this disc that have come out, which have been very appreciative, full of acclamation, they've explicitly been saying, there isn't a hint of crossover or pastiche here. What was it that gave you the confidence, finally, to actually make this direct kind of rapprochement between Indian classical music and ragas and your Western contemporary style? And key to this obviously was also finding the right collaborator.
Yes, well, let me start with just talking about the piece came from the premise, which was very strong within myself as I created this piece, that I must interlock the two musics together, but they must both be powerful and project their own music powerfully, even though they're from very different traditions. I wanted a modern feel. I wanted to use all the rich resources of contemporary harmony and orchestration when writing for a Western ensemble, not diatonic harmonies. And I asked the question, is it possible to embed raga-like material within more or less atonal or modal harmonic fields? And I tried to find ways to do that. So this required creating a new harmonic language, a notation, techniques for counterpoint. How do you put the things together? In fact, in the score, the Western musicians are explicitly requested not to try to imitate Indian music because it never works. You know, it takes years to learn how to play a note in an Indian style, you know, on an instrument. So they stay in distinct worlds and they find a way to talk to each other from their own strengths. And I chose for this collaboration the young sarod soloist Soumik Datta, who is based in UK, which was quite important. And he was very open, he was very amiable, and he's open-minded. He was willing to go outside his comfort zone. He has already collaborated with Western musicians in other genres. So he was an ideal choice. And he was flexible and easy to work with. He could improvise when he was required. He could play the notes when he was asked to play specific notes. So it was a very good collaboration. And he gave me ideas for what rags he might be able to play and what might work with certain modes. For instance, I used Messiaen modes, and I said, let's find some modes that are like super modes in which Messiaen can exist inside with an Indian rag, and they're in parallel universes, and they sound good because the super mode, as it were, takes care of the overall, you know, aggregate of notes that are sounding at any one time.
Yeah, and because I know we're drawing close, sadly, to the end of the time we have. I mean, we could talk for ages. We've got a couple of clips from Raga Fields, which three movements: void, tranquil, and vibrant. Slow to fast, which I guess actually is quite interesting because a lot of your pieces start with high energy and then end with slower serenity or exhaustion. But here you follow, I guess, the course of the way rags unfold from slow awakenings to more intense energy. We're going to hear a couple of clips from the third movement, and we might try actually and see if we can pretty much run those two clips together. So a little bit from the beginning of the third movement, and then the incredibly exciting and fast finale. And back over to you, Helen.
Yes, thank you. And that was extraordinary. I feel as though I've been, the last 45 minutes have been an extraordinary psychedelic journey, PB, through your life, your music, your ideas. And of course, we've just barely scratched the surface. And I'm pleased to say that the conversation that you've had has generated lots of interest and responses out there among our viewers. And clearly, PB, you have a passionate fan base, because someone has written of you the best opera composer in the world, which of course is something of a marvelous accolade, which I think we all agree with. We've also had some comments from viewers internationally. Someone has commented, many compositions have attempted to bring together Indian and Western classical music. One hears either predominantly an Indian sound or a Western sound. So I think that's really concurring with your account of the sort of the tendency to be very superficial in the way that these extraordinary, these extraordinary disciplines are brought together. And then the viewer goes on to say, do you think the time is right to bring the metaphysical aspect of Indian music theory and structural theory of Western music together? So do you think it's time for us to progress the sort of bringing together of these different schools? Is that possible in your view?
Well, I think I've tried to do that with Raga Fields, and that's only one way of doing that. There are other ways of doing that. I don't say that my way is the only way, but if it's a theoretical question, it's something that theorists might want to look at, but really the thing is, with Indian classical music, it's so idiosyncratic, so colored in its very specific, unique way. The moment it enters the fray, it takes over. And that was my problem when I started. I said, it just completely vanquishes everything in sight, and within this, Western music doesn't get a chance, and all the Western musicians that play this kind of fusion music are trying to sound Indian. So I had to really stop and say, I will not start from Indian music, I'll start from Western music. So the first things I wrote were first for the Western ensemble, and then I brought that in, with the Indian soloist. It's a very difficult area to negotiate. I'm not sure I have all the answers.
Mm. And of course, people don't normally train to the same degree in both forms of classical music. So you're going to be predominantly one or predominantly the other.
Yes, that's right.
So you are unique in this, then.
There might be some other experiments also being done. I'm not aware of them, but.
So you covered so much ground in your conversation. And I sort of want to go back to the beginning. Beethoven clearly was a sort of an extraordinary encounter for you. Can you sort of say more about, with the benefit of hindsight and experience, why he had such a huge impact on you? And have there been any other equivalent composers that have had almost as great an impact as Beethoven?
Well, thank you for asking that question, which is very hard to answer, like Stephen's first question. But I love and revere all the wonderful composers that have lived on this world and given wonderful music. I love them all. I don't dislike any of them, but there are two at the top for me, and they've always been Beethoven and Bach. And on my score, I often will play the opening chorus of opening music of the Matthew's Passion on my piano before I start composing. And I keep asking, what is this extraordinary quality that you experience when you hear this music? Of course, other composers have it too. I'm not saying this is only exclusive to Beethoven, but when you hear this in Beethoven, when you hear it in Bach, it is something beyond anything that I can explain or relate to. It's so remarkable and so profound. And one can't try to write like that, obviously, but it is what energizes me musically.
And would you say that your reaction is an emotional reaction?
physical, emotional, whatever you want to call it. I never use that word spiritual. I don't like it. I don't know what it means. You know, people use it all the time, but it completely encompasses you. It takes you over. You know, it's a full experience. It's an immersion in the sound. And these people lived. They didn't get many commissions. They were so poor most of the time. They wrote with this incredible integrity for the beauty and the purity of their writing. It's something to emulate.
We've had another question from one of our viewers, and the comment is, a very inspiring interview. What advice would you give to young composers who want to follow in your footsteps? Which could be interpreted in a number of ways. Your footsteps are very, very particular to you, obviously.
They must create their own footsteps into the world, not repeat my footsteps, but they need to find their source of energy and what is it that moves them. Because the writing of the music is about being profoundly moved by something. It's not just about pretty notes. We are not notesmiths or tunesters writing tunes, you know. Yes, we write tunes, but from what source is this music within you arising is the question you have to ask yourself as a young composer.
So can you talk more about that, PV, in terms of the education of a young composer? Because you say, I think I've read somewhere, I'm interested in the culture of the whole world and in the mythologies of parts of the world other than the one I was born into. So does that breadth of curiosity, how does that inform you as a composer? And is that something that you regard as critical to being a creative artist?
I do think it's very critical. I don't call myself an Indian composer. I'm just a composer, and I'm interested in many aspects of the world and many cultures and many countries. I'm actually interested in all the countries. I read the news voraciously every day. I'm very concerned about human rights violations in many theaters of the world today where terrible things are being done. The use of data to oppress people, for instance. There's not enough time in the world to write about all of this, and one can't always be writing about problems, but it certainly is a very important focus for me. I think I've lived in this country and I want to be inspired by things over here. I've worked with British writers, great British writers. So my next work is in fact a collaboration with a very great British writer, David Rudkin, who has already written 2 libretti for my opera and has written the dramatic poem for my 3rd opera, which I'm in the process of composing right now. And this is a remarkable author. So I'm interested in the cultures of the world. I've been to Korea. I wrote a piece inspired by Korean drumming, with the composer Un Suk Chin asked me to write. She sent me there on a very special mission, and it was a 10-day trip.
So PV, someone is asking, what creative personality in the world has had the biggest influence on your work? Can you point to one individual, either from your past or that you are currently, is in also currently, in your firmament, if you like, that has an overwhelming influence on you?
This actually connects up with Stephen's very interesting first question about dramaticism. And I would have to say that the long-term engagement with the remarkable dramatist David Rudkin has been seminal in the development of my dramatic work and my thinking about drama. He's a very great dramatist, and I'm very privileged that he was willing to write 3 libretti for me. The 3rd libretto is extraordinary, and it takes place in the contemporary world, and it is a story about contemporary refugees in an afflicted and oppressed landscape within which a rich array of characters, both human and non-human, arrive and narrate and bear witness to a meaning of a life lived with ethical clarity. It required an artist of great mental stamina and breadth of vision to write a script like that, which he has done. So that, I would say, has been a very crucial development right from the time when I first wrote my second opera, Broken Strings, for the Munich Biennale, where he created a magical world that I was able to explore in a very interesting way.
And do you think, PV, that these are very complex ideas in many ways, and they're very huge and profound ideas. How do you make that accessible to a general audience who won't necessarily have had that exposure?
How do you make that accessible is by working very hard, especially if it's drama. My libretto for the current opera is in its 11th draft. Gosh. And there are only 5 lines in common between the first draft, which came in 1996, and the present one, 5 lines in common. And the constant requirement that we placed on ourselves to make the image as clear, as interesting, as communicable as possible, so that an audience can actually receive this impression and be moved and touched by it. And to work with the music in a very intense way with my templates, so that no matter, I think I've said that in the CD as well, no matter what technique you use to generate the music, whether it's tone rows or harmonic fields or diatonic music or modes, make sure that that musical image is immediately understood by its audience. It doesn't require a PhD in compositional analysis to appreciate. And it's immediately visceral, it's immediately clear, and you can relate to it emotionally. Otherwise, you don't have any theater. So that theatrical discovery has, I suppose, inflected my other non-theatrical works as well, which is what Stephen was referring to in the beginning. So it's quite interesting that how that the two questions have tied into each other.
I hate to say it, we are sort of running out of time, which is terrible. There's so many questions that I haven't asked you. But can I ask you just the last question is, PD, what's ahead for you? What, thinking ahead to the next 5 years, say, what are the things that we can look forward to, and what do you, both the commissions you have, but also what you would like to do, where you feel yourself traveling in your life's work?
I think there's certainly at least another opera in the making. It's an opera which takes place in a very difficult landscape, which I won't mention right now, and how peace can be brought into that space. That's one possibility. I certainly want to write at least another concerto, possibly 2, and probably more orchestral works. I think I'm very interested in drama, and I certainly write at least 1 more opera, but maybe 2 or 3, I don't know.
Gosh, well, so much to look forward to, and probably, we hope, another release on NMC. Perhaps we can start planning that already, now that we've safely launched Wheeling Past the Stars, which I know is has enjoyed already huge success, and I'm sure will continue to enjoy huge success in the months and years to come. So
thank you. I'll take you up on that. Thank you.
So thank you both very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating hour. I mean, as I said, we could have gone on, and we've just scratched the surface, but there's plenty more to enjoy on our website. And of course, there is your disc that is available for people to download and to buy. To our audience out there, I very much hope you've enjoyed this hour with PV and with Stephen Newbould. Do please visit our website, browse our online shop, look at our Discover pages, where there's lots of fascinating content about the world of new music and our catalogue and our composers. And if you feel so inspired, please make a donation, because the wonderful work of NMC really depends on the generosity of people who believe in our mission just as much as we do. So thank you for joining us, and please join us again soon. Thank you.